This is the Sjogren automatic shotgun.
Hello everybody, today we're going to be taking a look at the Sjogren shotgun. Now this video is going to be a pretty comprehensive sort of an omnibus look at the gun. We're going to detail strip it, we're going to look at how it works, we're going to describe how it works, we're going to touch on its history, we're going to describe the inertia system of operation because this is going to be the first video in a series of videos on inertia operated shotguns in general. So you will have to buckle up and I will try to remember to leave timestamps throughout the comments for people who are trying to find one particular thing. We'll also have a shooting segment on this shotgun, and we're also going to work in a troubleshooting segment on this shotgun because none of these shotguns ever want to work because they weren't designed very well. It's going to be a very long video, but rather than break it up into a bunch of different videos, I figured I might as well put all of the information in one place and have one video about this gun. Now, right off the bat, the most important thing to discuss with this gun is how on earth is the name pronounced? S-J-O-G-R-E-N. Is that Sjogren? Is that Huggrine? Is that Hugrin? Sjogren? Sjogrine? How is that supposed to be pronounced? Unfortunately, I'm not sure that there is actually a very clear answer. The name Sjogren comes from the inventor of this shotgun mechanism, one Carl Sjogren. Carl was Swedish, and I have asked different Swedish-speaking people, both people who were born there and have spoke the language their entire life, people who have picked up the language along the way, as well as people who have since left the country and only remember a little bit of the language, how this gun's name is supposed to be pronounced. And I have gotten like 7 different answers from such people. The most consistent answer that I've got from Swedish-speaking people is that it's some combination of ho and then grine, but you slap your back of your tongue against the roof of your mouth between the 2 syllables, so it's like Sjogren, something like that, or Sjogrine. I don't know. They haven't been terribly consistent about it, and as a result, I've never been terribly consistent about how I pronounce it. Because to be honest with you, it doesn't even seem like native speakers are exactly sure how to pronounce the name of this shotgun. But with that said, we're pretty much teed off to get into the history of the Sjogren. As mentioned, Carl Sjogren was an arms designer working in Sweden, and around the same time that John Browning was working on finishing the Auto 5, Carl was working on designing an automatic shotgun of his own. Now, at this time in automatic arms development, most guns were going in the direction of recoil operation. That is, the bolt and barrel are locked into each other and are capable of floating relative to the rest of the gun, and the actual force of recoil on those reciprocating parts is what causes the gun to cycle. But Carl's idea here differed from them pretty substantially. His idea was to use something that we today call inertia operation to make his shotgun function. Now, various different countries and various different languages have considered inertia operated shotguns a form of recoil operation for a long time, although as far as guns are classified these days, we don't really classify inertia operated as a form of recoil operation, and a lot of this just comes down to frames of reference. Later on in the video, whenever we get into talking about how the action works, we'll be able to hopefully illustrate why that is exactly, but the important thing to remember is that this is not a gas-operated shotgun. Now, admittedly, the intricate details of this shotgun's development are not my forte. My interest is more along the lines of long recoil-operated shotguns, and so there are a lot of blanks in this gun's story. However, eventually, Carl gets his prototype finished, gets a couple of patents associated with the way the gun works, develops a couple of rifles based on the inertia-operated principle as well, but wants to get his shotgun into production. He ends up securing a production contract for 5,000 of the guns in 1905. The guns are to be manufactured by Handfabenverkstedern Copenhagen, which roughly translates to like manual manufacturing factory or something like that, and Copenhagen, of course, in Denmark was where these shotguns were manufactured. This contract was to be the only contract production of these guns. 5,000 units were made, production spanned about a year, and that was to be the end of this shotgun's history. These 5,000 guns were sold widely over Europe, and it seems that some around this time were brought into the United States, although the lack of import laws in the US at this time makes it very difficult to track down if there was a US importer or this was just a thing where US companies that sold guns would just buy onesie-twosie at a time and then sell them to their customers here in the US. Ultimately, the inertia-operated system that Sjogren worked so hard to develop would fall completely into obscurity. There would not be another gun to utilize this operating mechanism until much later in history. We're talking like 1970s, 1980s, when an Italian inventor by the name of Bruno Civillani would come across an example of a Sjogren shotgun and be immediately fascinated. Eventually, Civillani would bring that idea to Benelli, and the rest of that is fairly well-known history, but we'll talk about that in a separate video where we look at specifically the Benelli inertia-operated system. For now, we're looking at the original recipe Sjogren system. And what better way to learn more about that system than to take a look at this example we have here in front of us. Now, this particular Sjogren has seen a pretty hard life. The gun has quite a bit of wear on it and it has seen a fair amount of use. The external features of the gun that are most notable are this weird handguard system, where the handguard just covers the mag tube itself and then has a protrusion here that goes up over the barrel, which is, I guess, meant to be where you grasp it. For as large as my hands are, this is not a particularly comfortable handguard, and for me to grasp it comfortably, my thumb ends up touching the barrel, which then makes it an uncomfortable grasp. It's certainly a very petite handguard that tells that this shotgun is from a time where most people were familiar with side-by-side shotguns, where your hand's going to be touching both barrels pretty much by default. And that Sjogren with his shotgun really wasn't aware of the fact that, you could get a shotgun hot enough that it would be very uncomfortable to touch. And moving backwards behind the handguard, we have a Winchester-style takedown system that we'll take a closer look at later. Further backwards, we have our bolt/breech block, which is retractable. It has these serrated portions to make that a little bit easier. We have a Mauser-style safety flag, which also works as a recocker for the shotgun, where in this upright position, the bolt is locked from being able to retract, and the trigger will no longer drop the striker. But returning the striker to the ready position, we can then take the gun off safe, and pulling the trigger will drop the striker. At this point, recocking it involves pushing the flag up and over, which is a quite stiff experience, and then taking it back off will then ready the striker to strike again. This does give the gun restrike capability to some extent, which is an interesting feature, but as we'll talk about later, this isn't a particularly ergonomic thing to do, having to flip the flag up, and if, for example, you had a light strike, you can't just pull back the bolt to be able to reset the striker. You have to flip this up and then back down to then withdraw the bolt, which is a pretty serious inconvenience if you're trying to move quickly and get a jam cleared. Moving further back, we have a hump here on the receiver. This is really just a spring-loaded end stop. The springs on these aren't particularly stiff, and it really just pushes against the wood of the stock, so it can't possibly be doing much. But this functions as a positive inward stop for the bolt. To prevent hard metal-on-metal contact, it just has a little bit of springiness to help slow down the last bit of velocity that the bolt has. Behind that, we have our safety, where we go backwards for safe and forwards for fire. Tank safeties on automatic shotguns are never not cool, just because it's not something that you see very often. Finally, behind that, we have a straight-style English stock. And one thing I would like to point out that's very interesting about these guns is it's very uncommon to see these stocks cracked. I'm not enough of a wood savant to know what wood was used here, but it certainly has to be pretty decent stuff, because this gun saw quite a few rounds through it, and it has a tiny little hairline crack down there, and I've put hundreds of rounds through the gun since I've got it, and that crack hasn't moved. So the stocks on these guns, both for the forend and the stock, are made out of some pretty decent stuff. Finally, on the back of the shotgun, we have a butt pad bearing the VSA logo for the shotgun. The only other items to note are, of course, we have a trigger down here, and we have an elevator system that's not dissimilar to the Remington 1100, though this came way before the Remington 1100, where the elevator cannot go up until its little middle bisector section is pushed in, at which point it can then be loaded. Whenever the bolt is locked to the rear, depressing that little toggle button is what lets the bolt carrier come forward and snaps the elevator up with it. In the shooting segment of the video, we'll go more over the manual of arms and how specifically the gun is loaded and unloaded and dealt with. But for now, we're ready to start digging into the way the gun actually works. Our first step in doing this is going to be briefly describing how the inertia-operated system works with the gun assembled. I think once the gun's taken apart, we'll be able to see a little easier how that actually works, but it's important to see from the outside how it works. I'll try and overlay a little bit of slow motion footage of the gun firing here as we describe it to hopefully help illustrate, again, the external view of the way inertia operation works. Now, the first step to understanding inertia operation is understanding that guns recoil. This is not a particularly novel thing, but in the case of a shotgun, that's quite obvious, right? You shoot the gun, and the gun's going to move backwards and then push you backwards a little bit with it. In the case of recoil-operated firearms, the bolt and barrel are going to be locked together, and they're going to move together before they then move the rest of the gun, before the rest of the gun then moves you. So in something like an Auto 5, we're used to seeing the barrel and bolt recoil while the rest of the gun holds still, and then as the springs get compressed slowly by the barrel and bolt, the gun will start to move, and then it will start to move the shooter. Effectively, the recoil is cycling the gun, and then the recoil reaches the shooter. So you're having the recoil do a little bit of work to reload the gun. And in this regard, inertia operation is a form of recoil operation. It's just not short recoil or long recoil. It's like inertia recoil operated. Whenever a shotgun like the Sjogren is fired, immediately the gun is going to start recoiling. The barrel, receiver, stock, and bolt itself are going to recoil backwards, but the bolt carrier is going to stay right where it was. It's not going to be for a very long period of time, but the rest of the gun is going to recoil while the bolt carrier group stays right where it is. Between the bolt carrier and the bolt itself, there's a very, very heavy spring, one that you'd have to put in a vise to be able to compress, or have a 12 gauge amount of recoil trying to compress that spring. After the gun fires, the recoil of the rest of the gun is going to push that spring against the bolt carrier. It's that objects at rest tend to stay at rest. Well, the bolt group is going to stay at rest because the recoil from the fired round hasn't pushed on it yet. In order for the bolt carrier to get pushed on, that big drive spring is going to have to get compressed first. As that spring gets compressed by the rest of the gun running backwards, now the bolt carrier has that spring pushing on it. Your body is going to stop the recoil of the rest of the gun. Normally whenever a gun recoils, we're used to seeing the gun move backwards, and then the person's body is going to stop the gun from moving backwards. It's at this point that that compressed spring between the rest of the gun and the bolt group is going to be able to uncompress, only because the rest of the gun is quite heavy and the bolt carrier is quite light. That spring is going to push the bolt carrier backwards a lot harder than it's going to push the rest of the gun forwards. And it's at this moment that the gun will cycle. The bolt will be driven to the back by its drive spring, which was compressed by the recoil from the fired round. As it moves backwards, it will compress a secondary spring, which is really the regular recoil or action spring, that will then push the bolt back forwards to chamber the next round. Now, as a quick demonstration, we can push forward in the bolt carrier group just to compress that drive spring a tiny bit. Of course, whenever the round is fired, it will be compressed quite a bit further than this. But we can see there that little bit of movement springs backwards because there's a spring inside the gun that we're compressing. Once we get the gun taken apart, we'll be able to see that drive spring and better visualize how it actually functions. But my favorite thing about the Sjogren shotgun is that inertia operation in firearms is very difficult to understand. But I think the Sjogren makes it much easier to understand than pretty much any other gun you can look at. I know Benelli's got those famous advertisements showing the Benelli system and how it works. Most people will watch that and still misunderstand the way that inertia operation works. I think that the Sjogren is the perfect way to study it and understand it and get to know it just a little bit better. And as we tear the thing apart, hopefully I'll be able to convey to you guys a better understanding of how inertia operation functions. One last word on inertia operation before we get the gun taken apart. A lot of people will confuse inertia operation with being a form of blowback operation, right? Where the fired round is just pushing the bolt backwards. This is not true. Inertia operated systems are all locked breech, right? The bolt is locked solidly into the receiver or the barrel, right? Everything is all locked up tight. In the case of this gun, it's sort of a dropping block that we'll be able to see later, but in the case of like the Benelli inertia shotguns, those are rotating bolt. The bolt rotates into a barrel extension like we're used to seeing on like a gas-operated Beretta, for example. And this makes it plainly not a form of blowback action, and it's not a form of delayed blowback either, because the breech is going to stay locked until an external member acts on the bolt to unlock it. In the case of an inertia-operated shotgun like we have here, that's the bolt carrier being pushed backwards by the drive spring will unlock the bolt, pick it up, and then pull it backwards. So keep that in mind as we're taking the gun apart. Inertia operation is not blowback, it's not a form of delayed blowback, it is a true locked breech action. The only where there's really debate to happen is whether or not inertia operated is a form of recoil operation, or we should just call it recoil operation or not. I'm personally of the opinion that we shouldn't. However, for many years, and in fact in some languages still, inertia operation is just referred to as a form of recoil operation. As we mentioned before, this gun has a Winchester-style takedown system. I don't know that we've looked at a Winchester takedown shotgun before on the channel, but we'll see in a second what that means. In order to disassemble the Sjogren, we have to push down this spring retainer to rotate the mag tube over and then pull it forwards. Once it's pulled forwards, the entire barrel will then rotate independent of the receiver, and they'll come separate. This method of separating on a set of interrupted threads is what I refer to as a Winchester-style takedown. To be honest with you, I don't know if Winchester came up with it first, but Winchester really popularized it, with both the Model 12 and the 1897 offering it in certain versions. Like mini takedown shotguns, as a result of wear and tear or general use, the barrel fitment to the receiver can get a little bit wiggly. In the troubleshooting section of the video, we'll sort of address how to try and tighten up the barrel to receiver fitment on a Sjogren. So if that's really what you're looking for, you can skip ahead to that section. But for now, what we'll do is do a little bit of stripping here on the front magazine section. We'll need our set of parallel tip screwdrivers. Do not try to work on one of these guns without a set of parallel tip screwdrivers. If you don't know what a parallel tip screwdriver set is, don't work on one of these guns at all until you've figured that out. But here is a quick lesson. Most screwdriver tips that you'll find, typical ones, are tapered. This lets them fit a wide variety of screw slots. However, it won't let them get those screws very tight. And for tasks like putting light fixtures on your wall, this is fine. You don't need those screws to be tight. But for the screws that go into guns, we do need them to be a little bit tighter than the things holding pieces of plastic onto your wall. As a result, you need a screwdriver tip that, instead of being tapered, is parallel to the slots in the screw. Using a taper tip screwdriver to try and remove screws that are in there very tight will just damage the screw pretty badly. And as a result, we should be using parallel tip screwdrivers anytime that we're working on a gun. But the first screw that we'll need to remove is this one here on the bottom of the mag tube. And it comes out like so. And this will let us withdraw the magazine tube. We can see now that the magazine tube has its own set of interrupted threads that we previously released. We have a follower here and a pretty weak magazine spring. We'll talk more in a little bit, probably in the troubleshooting section, about why it's important for that magazine spring to be so weak. You don't just want to go and put a heavy one in here because it'll cause other problems for the gun. But if you run into issues with your Sjogren of not wanting to be all the way in battery, especially whenever the gun is fully loaded, you would want to check that section of the troubleshooting out. But moving on for now, we can fully disassemble the magazine tube by taking this itty bitty little lock screw out here, which lets us remove the cap. Be very careful when dealing with this screw because it is very, very little and would be easy to strip out, like especially if you were not using the correct screwdrivers, as we've already talked about. It'd be very, very important on this screw to make sure that you're using a screwdriver tip that fits the screw correctly. At this point, we can remove this cap, and we have the world's wimpiest magazine spring. And the follower will then come out behind it, like so. We now have our follower and our magazine spring. Nothing really impressive going on here except for the fact that it's kind of a large follower compared to what we've seen at least on Auto 5s, but nothing too novel going on there. We have our cap, where we have a screw on the inside holding our sling swivel on, but otherwise nothing very remarkable there. But for now, that's pretty much all we need to see as far as the magazine tube is concerned, and we can set it over there with its friends. And remember to keep its screws with it, because some of the screws in this gun sort of look similar to one another. At this point, we can then flip the barrel assembly over, and we can find the proper screwdriver to fit into this screw's slot. And removing this screw will let us remove the handguard. Be as gentle as possible with these screws. And this one doesn't usually need to come all the way out, just far enough to wiggle off. And at this point, our handguard is free. And now we can see what an incredibly thin, dinky little piece of wood we have going on here. It's really pretty fascinating to me that you don't see more of these guns with this piece of wood broken. I guess it's because you don't have to take the handguard off as a part of regular maintenance, and so they don't end up getting dinged up because of that, but this really is a incredibly fragile feeling piece of wood. So we're just going to go ahead and put it way off over here to the side to minimize its chances of getting run into by anything else. At this point, our barrel assembly is pretty much disassembled. You can slide the mag tube / handguard retainer off the rest of the way if you would like to, but we're just going to go ahead and leave it in its place. And the last thing we have here on the barrel is its receiver ring and its locking collar. Just like the Winchesters, you have an adjustment screw here. Whenever the screw is removed, you're able to pull back a locking piece. Whenever that locking piece is removed, you can actually thread in and out this interrupted thread section, and this is how you adjust the tightness or looseness of the barrel relative to the receiver to take out any slop that exists in the takedown mechanism of the gun. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the troubleshooting section of the video, but that's really all that you have going on as far as the rest of your barrel assembly goes. We'll go ahead and set our barrel all the way out of the way, and at this point we're ready to tear into the receiver unit a little bit further. The first step in taking the receiver apart is going to be popping out this screw from the stock here. It's important to know that the stocks are sprung backwards. There's a little spring pushing the stock backwards, so as you take this screw out, it can be a good idea to sort of compress the stock against the receiver. I'm going to do so like this, just putting the receiver down in this direction. And with our screwdriver tight in the slot, we can then back this screw out. Remember just to put a little bit of downwards pressure to keep that spring in the stock, letting the screw bind up. If you don't control that spring at all, it will cause this screw to get tight sometimes. And the screw doesn't have a ton of threads on it. It's not like a Auto 5 Tang screw where you'll sit there and think that you just got to go at it forever. What I like to do is, really once it's loosened about that far, I'll just take a punch and then push on it, because of course screwing it out won't work any further at that point. And then you can take the screw out, set it there, and now we can see that spring that's in there pushes the receiver about that far forward. And there is that spring. So the spring's there. That's really just the spring that drives that buffer, that in stop that we had shown. And it also is responsible for retaining that buffer slash in stop. So you can see the buffer slash in stop there. It rocks forwards and backwards. Once the stock's taken off the gun, it can just be lifted straight out. It's a pretty serious chunk of steel going on there. We can just set it to the side for now. Set our receiver to the side, set our stock screw over there. Take one final look here at the stock. Really the weakest piece on the wood of these guns is that sometimes that hole that this spring sits down into will crack or get damaged. So that can be one thing to pay attention to on these guns, one thing that would be pretty easy to repair as well, because there is no action tube or spring that goes way down inside of the stock like on an Auto 5. This is really just a dumb, stupid piece of wood that just has a spring sitting in the front of it. And with that discussed, we can put our stock over there with our handguard way out of the way, and return our attention to our receiver. At this point, the gun's been stripped down pretty tight, and the cool thing about it is that there's not really any complexity going on anywhere until you get to the core receiver unit. Once you get here, the complexity starts to ramp up pretty quickly, but all of the other parts are relatively simple in the way they fit and function together. Now, the first step in disassembling the receiver unit is going to be removing this screw, which is going to let us get the recoil springs out. The recoil springs are probably the weakest part of this gun's design. Very, very frequently, you will find these guns with recoil springs that are either worn out or collapsed or missing or have been replaced with a spring that doesn't work properly, or any of the other funny business that can happen with a recoil spring. But we can pop this one out here and see I am using a recoil spring that I sort of made, plus a little spacer buffer assembly, just because I've seen too many of these receivers crack where the recoil spring goes. Now, I believe this is usually as a result of somebody making a new spring for the gun, and that spring not having enough space to fully compress before the bolt is all the way back, which causes the bolt to bottom out on this little screw and then cracks the receiver. But out of an abundance of caution, I just got an extra stiff, small diameter spring, a washer, and then sort of the regular sized recoil spring for the gun. And we'll talk about it more in the troubleshooting section of the video, but what I've fashioned here makes it so that as the bolt group comes all the way back to bottoming out, it will just barely begin to compress this extra stiff spring, so it acts as a little bit of a buffer to hopefully prevent this receiver from seeing that crack that I've seen on a couple other receivers. Now, with that said, we can put our recoil assembly to the side, and now pull the bolt back part way, and there's this little U-shaped hoop slash latch over the top of the receiver that we need to remove. Now, as you're doing this, I recommend that you don't support the receiver by the bottom of the trigger guard for any sort of hammering or prying, just because these trigger guards are pretty thin. So I'm going to hold the action group in my hand, and then we're going to take a flat blade screwdriver and pry this little U-shaped thing up. This, in my opinion, is the second weakest thing about this gun. That U-shaped thing is a compliant mechanism made out of 1905 steel. I don't know that they knew how to make very good springy steel back then, because I have seen a ton of these U-shaped things break. Once they break, that's quite an interesting part for a gunsmith to have to remake. But in general, the way to get that off is balance a screwdriver, sort of something like that, and just give it a decent little tap with your hand. Maybe a little bit more than that. And that will pop it up halfway. Once it's popped off halfway, get your screwdriver situated again and give it another tap. And it'll pop out just like that. If your gun hasn't been taken apart in a long time, I have seen some of these that get stuck in there really tight. The thing that I would caution against is just getting a great big screwdriver and going nuts trying to pry on it, because you can get these to crack as mentioned. They're very thin up there and there's no radius in the roots of their arms. These things are really just asking to break. But I've had this one in and out of the gun probably 50 times at this point, and it's still holding up okay. So it's not to say that these pieces are very weak. I think when they crack, it's probably more often a case of somebody trying to take them out improperly. It is very important as you're removing it, right, that it comes up straight. And whenever you're putting it back into the gun, it has to go down straight. You can get it so that one leg is locked in first and then try and hammer the other leg in. That's going to crack it. When you're popping it out, you can get one leg to pop up first. Trying to pry the other leg out will try and crack it and bend it and do all sorts of bad stuff to it. So it needs to come out straight, needs to go in straight. If you're taking it out and it's not wanting to go straight, like one leg's popped up earlier as you're trying to pry it out, get yourself a little rubber hammer, just like this. This is all you need to seat it back in there, and then tap that leg back down so it's sitting flat, and then try again. Those are my secrets as far as taking these things in and out. But here's that little U-shaped, I guess, locking piece, key piece. And really what this is doing is holding the three major pieces of the bolt group together. In order to get this piece off, we're going to push the whole bolt group to the front of the receiver while holding the receiver straight up and down. It's important that you hold the receiver up and down while you do this, because pushing this bolt group forwards is now going to let the bolt and bolt carrier itself lock into the receiver, and now this outer cover piece can just slide cleanly off the back. This outer piece is probably better described as just being an inertia mass, and whenever it has this peg installed in it, it locks that inertia mass to the bolt carrier itself. So they act as one unit whenever it's fully assembled, but then for the purposes of disassembly, they then come apart as separate pieces. So while it's not wrong to think of this piece as a bolt carrier, this thing sort of has a weird three-part bolt system that makes it difficult to describe with the bolt and bolt carrier terms we usually use. In order to get the last two pieces of the bolt group out, we will pull up on this locking piece, then pull the unit to the back, and then swing it over to this side of the receiver, at which point it will sort of wiggle off. There's this round stud that interacts with this piece down here in the gun, and that's sort of how these hold together, is you have to swing this over and then get it out of the way of this machined tang on the top of the receiver, and then it will just pull off. We'll set our receiver group to the side for now, because now we're looking at our bolt group. Now, as we just showed, the locking block just pulls out of the bolt block itself, like so. You have a single claw extractor, which is held in by a solid pin. I know we said we'd be detail stripping, but again, I lied slightly. I'm not going to pull the extractor out just because there isn't a great reason to. Additionally, the bolt houses your ejector. The ejector is this blade that sits there on the side of the bolt block, and whenever the bolt itself reciprocates backwards, this foot on the bottom of the ejector will hit this machined bump there on the receiver, and what that's going to do is pull the blade of the ejector out. Hopefully you guys will be able to see that pretty well, but you can see the ejector stick its nose forward there. Removing the ejector on these guns can be kind of tricky, and so I recommend that you get a rag to wrap the bottom of the bolt group in, because these things have sharp edges on them, and cutting yourself is never fantastic. But what I like to do is take a punch, rest it against the bottom of the table, and then push up. And then once you've pushed that block up far enough, you can then push it over. It will sort of hold itself in place like that. And then pushing it the rest of the way over will let this spring off of the bolt group itself. We can demonstrate like this. There we go. And then there's our ejector. That is a comically thin piece of steel, by the way. A very intricate, interesting piece that they've got going on there. And then finally here is our spring for our ejector. We'll talk about it more in the troubleshooting section, but making sure you have an extra stiff spring, a new spring, a replacement spring in the ejector is pretty darn important to making these guns work reliably. But for now, that's our bolt group pretty much stripped. Again, it's just a solid pin, right? You'd get a punch and then punch down on that pin. I'm just not interested in doing that. But there is your inner bolt group disassembled. Now we have our outer bolt group, and it's a little bit less fun to disassemble. The first step in disassembling it will be to set it to safe. At this point, there is a pin that needs to be drifted out from the back of the bolt group back here. On the very tail end of the striker, it'll be pretty difficult to see on a lot of these guns, but there's a pin that needs to be drifted out. The problem with doing this is that the bolt group on these guns is round, and it really doesn't want to be supported as you try to punch on it. Like, it doesn't sit on a punch block, it just wants to roll off. Even a good magnetic punch block, it just never wants to find a place that it quite fits right. So what I've had the most success with doing is just wadding up a rag, like so, to sort of support the radius of the part so that you can push it down with one hand and then sort of hammer on it with the other. Something sort of like this gives you a pretty decent base to work off of. We'll get ourselves a punch, and what we'll do is then drive this pin out of the bolt. Moving to the smaller punch, the pin is now moving for us. And we will just tap it out, withdraw our punch, and now we can see, hopefully now you guys can actually see the pin now that it's partway stuck out. And I'm just going to use a pair of pliers to pull that pin the rest of the way. And there we have that little bitty pin. I'll set it over there with the rest of our bolt group parts. And this will then let us push the striker in towards the bolt group to spin the rear end of that striker group off. This is not entirely dissimilar to how you have to do it with a Mauser, and like with a Mauser, you kind of want a special tool. So the tool that I have used has just been this great big hollow piece of alloy steel. You could make a tool, it does not need to be steel, you could just use a wood tool to do this. It just has to be hollow to fit over the tip of the striker, such that the tip of the striker cannot contact the inside of the hole, because you do not want to bend the tip of your striker. You don't want to have to make a new striker for these bolts. So a tool that can slip over it without touching it, and then what you're going to do is I'm going to put this end of the bar against my chest, then I'm going to pull the entire bolt group towards me, and as I do that, you'll be able to see the end of the striker stick out that way. I guess you could just push this against the end of the table like this. However, that's going to make it pretty difficult for you guys to see what I'm doing. So I'm just going to stab it against my stomach and then show you how you can rotate the end of the safety flag off, just like that. And now the safety flag is off. Oh, and we can breathe again that we're no longer being stabbed by this awful mechanism. At this point, we have our flag, as mentioned. Our flag, of course, you can see the pinhole was cross-pinned to the striker. We have a couple of springs on our striker. This is the striker spring. This is a spacer that somebody put on this striker, I guess to increase the effective striking force of the striker. These guns can sometimes have a problem with light striking, and you may even notice that the striker on mine has a little bit of machining blue on it. That's because whoever had this gun before me broke the striker off, very hastily brazed it back into the front of the bolt. That repair has been holding up okay, but they repaired it in such a manner that the striker was too long and the gun would slam fire, which is suboptimal. So I had to machinist blue it and do a little bit of a fixing of their repair job. But the end result of all of that drama is that the gun now doesn't light strike. So we'll talk about it again in the troubleshooting section, but it seems like the installation of a collar can be done to try and increase the effective force of the striker spring. You could probably also just replace the striker spring, but in classic 1905 fashion, the spring is a square wire coil, so getting an exact duplicate of the spring would be probably pretty darn expensive. But that's pretty much it for your striker. You can definitely see Mauser inspiration throughout the actual firing, the firing mechanism of this gun. Very, very Mauser inspired, I'd say. But that set to the side, we finally have that drive spring that I talked about. This is a really, really stiff spring. Like really stiff. Whenever the gun fires, this spring will get most of the way compressed, which is pretty impressive. This spring sits down into this recess there in our inertia block right here. And of course, the inner bolt group sits inside this block like so. As we explained before, whenever the gun fires, this bolt group with its locking block are locked into the receiver, right? These are locked down tight in the receiver. The fired shell is going to be pushing on this bolt face, which is locked into the receiver. Because these are locked together, these are going to start moving backwards together, right? That's recoil. So this bolt block, right, the breech block itself will be recoiling. This outer cover will be stagnant because there's nothing making it recoil yet. This is going to get pushed backwards, right? This is moving backwards, this is staying still under inertia. And these two are going to compress the spring together. Right, there you go, there's that spring. Imagine this spring, right, this gap closes all the way up. That gap right there, because that spring gets compressed all the way. There's now quite a bit of force in that spring that's trying to spring these things back apart. It's going to be your body against the stock that's going to stop the parts that are moving backwards from moving backwards, right? You're going to arrest it because it's pushing back into your body. So it recoils, but then it stops because your body stopped it. At the moment your body stops it, this spring is fully compressed. The spring is going to push both directions, right? It's going to try pushing this forwards, which is going to try and push the rest of the gun forwards. However, the rest of the gun is pretty heavy, and you're holding on to it with your hands. So it's going to stay more or less still. This outer bolt unit, though, is relatively light, and it's going to get pushed backwards quite hard. As it gets pushed backwards, whenever this U-shaped clip is correctly installed, it will push backwards and then lift up on the locking block. Easy way to see that is we take the U-shaped clip, sort of set it on here where it rides. What it will do is these two fingers here on the locking block, it was going to pick those up, just like that. So the locking block in its locked position forward is like this. Whenever the drive spring pushes this operating block backwards, this U-shaped clip is of course installed in the top of it there, and that U-shaped clip will be sitting about here and will pull the locking block up. Once it's pulled the locking block up, the reciprocating parts of the gun go backwards, your firing cycle is completed, and then your recoil spring is going to push the bolt back forwards. There's inertia operation. Isn't that simple? Wasn't that a nice long-winded explanation? Hopefully seeing the pieces out of the gun like this makes it a little bit more obvious that really what inertia operation refers to is you have a mass, right? This is a pretty decently heavy part. In fact, if we flop our little handy scale on here, the weight of this part that the gun's actually working against is, of course, it's got all the striker pieces weight added to it as well. The spring only technically counts as far as a mass analysis, but we're about a pound, right? So you've got about a pound of inertia weight that's just sitting there on the gun. Recoil is not going to move this part. Recoil is going to move the rest of the gun towards this part, and it's going to compress this spring as the rest of the parts move backwards. This compression of this spring stores energy in the spring until the gun has stopped recoiling because you've stopped it with your body, right? It recoils into your body and then you stop it. This spring is still compressed. This spring is going to push everything backwards and cycle the gun. So as much as it is recoil operation, it's really like stored spring energy operation. This is one of those instances where different languages trying to classify guns different ways will end up using the same word to mean different things. In Italian, long recoil operation is referred to as spring operated because it's really a spring that's cycling the gun. Meanwhile, if we were to try and classify inertia operation in contrast with recoil operation, we'd probably focus on the fact that there's energy stored in the spring and call this a spring-operated action. So it's very interesting, right? Where describing this as operated by recoil isn't incorrect, but calling it recoil-operated probably isn't correct because recoil-operated means something else for a wide number of other systems. Anyway, all that bleeding aside, we'll go ahead and put a couple more pieces to the side here. We'll go ahead and put this steel rod over here. Hopefully avoid beating up our wood with it. But at this point, that can go there, this can go there, and so can that. Our striker mechanism is disassembled. We can put it there. We can put the locking block there too, but we have a few more pieces to pull out of this breech bolt mass system here. The first is this striker flag safety system. It rotates about this far and then will pop out. An important reliability thing to make sure of on these guns. Again, I'll re-mention it in the troubleshooting section, but there is a detent system with this detent that pushes on one of these two positions on the bolt block, right, for this flag. if this detent spring wears out, and it wears out on a lot of these guns, this flag can sort of just rotate willy-nilly as the gun's shooting. It sort of flips between there and there as the gun's shooting. If the gun is fired whenever the flag is sort of in this upright position, that flag can beat into this bolt stop and chip it like this one is. I noticed that it was chipped. I noticed how it got chipped, and then I went ahead and replaced the detent spring underneath this detent, but that's certainly one thing to be aware of with these guns. We'll mention it again in the troubleshooting section, but there's that. Take the flag off, and then there is a spring down inside of there that I probably won't bother with pulling out, but there's a spring down inside that hole. If you've got your original spring in there, the secret is to take a 3.5mm drill bit, stick it down in there, give it a quarter twist, and just pull the drill bit out, and the spring should come with it. But there's that mechanism there. And then the final piece of disassembly that we get to do here on the bolt is to take this screw out. And for that, we'll want a slightly less narrow bit, and we'll stick that down in here and pull this screw out. Note that this screw is down into a blind hole, so if you break this screw, you're in trouble. It's not going to be a good time. So of course, be very, very careful with this screw. Comes out about that far. It will pull out the rest of the way. However, what you'll want to do is hold this piece right here as you pull this screw out, because this is really your sear, and then there's a little flat spring underneath it. And this is probably the third weakest thing about these guns. I've seen a lot of these guns that have this spring break. Sometimes the guns will still work with this spring broken, but oftentimes the spring will break, and when the spring is broken, the gun can sometimes still cock itself, sometimes, and then sometimes it will just decide to uncock itself on its own. So this spring being broken can make the guns unsafe. Besides that, you then have your sear right here. The way that the sear works, we'll be able to talk about a little bit more once we get the trigger group taken apart. But in general, you have a tooth here on the sear that's going to interface with the ledge there on the striker flag on the end of the striker. Whenever the trigger is pulled, it will interface with that itty-bitty little tooth there on the sear to pull it down. So the trigger getting pulled will pull the sear down like that. Whenever the sear is then pulled down, the striker can go forward. After the sear releases the striker, the striker goes forward, sets off the round, and it begins the cycling of the gun. As the rest of the gun is recoiling, it sort of recoils and pushes the striker backwards, as the outer bolt shell here is sort of holding still. So the rest of the gun is getting pushed back by recoil. It's also going to be pushing the striker back on recoil, and it's this process that's actually going to push the striker back enough that it's going to recock. Now, if you remember how tight this spring was on the striker, as I had to compress it to spin the flag off on the rear end, that's a pretty darn stiff spring that we got going on here. And that should help contextualize how much stronger this spring is. Because this spring has to be compressed hard enough that not only is this spring also getting compressed in order to recock the striker, but then the bolt grip is going to have enough oomph after all of that from this spring to cycle it all the way to the back, and then it's going to be pushed back forward by the action spring. That's pretty darn cool. And I'll try and overlay a little bit of slow-mo to sort of show off how after the gun fires, the striker gets recocked, and then the gun goes in cycles. It's a very cool thing. In the troubleshooting section, we'll talk briefly about, if you've got one of these guns that fails to recock, it can be a couple of different things, but one of the things that it can be is that this spring is actually too stiff, and or the loads that you're using aren't generating enough recoil to get the pieces to compress far enough for this to recock and then this to cycle the action. But at this point, we've got a fully disassembled outer breech bolt. Set that to the side. Get our striker pieces out of the way. Get our sear and its spring to the side. We'll take the screw for retaining the sear, put it over there, the flag back there. And at this point, we're ready to get into the trigger and feeding mechanism of this gun. We're close to the end as far as understanding how this thing works. So I had talked previously that really what happens with the sear, its interaction with the trigger, is by way of this tiny foot on the sear, and that it gets pulled down by the trigger. If we look right there on the receiver, we'll be able to see that the trigger pull drops down that member. I refer to that as the trigger connector because it's not quite a disconnector, right? This connects the trigger to the sear as the sear comes forward. And as the sear on the bolt rides forward and backwards, the connector itself actually rotates out of the way like so. It gets pushed that way. As the sear comes past it, right? As the sear comes back, it'll pop past it that way and then pop into it this way. and then that little foot there on the sear will get pulled down by that claw on the connector in order to make the gun cycle. We'll get a better look at that in a moment, but that's how it works there in the gun. Now, disassembly of the sort of trigger guts of the gun is facilitated by 1, 2, 3 different screws. We'll get those taken out here with our flat blade screwdriver. There's one of them. Get our sear out of the way. There's one screw. And another one. And our final screw at the back of the trigger guard here. And this screw does go all the way through the trigger group, and the trigger group is sprung downward, so it can help to hold up on the trigger group as you remove this last screw. And it will pull out, and then our trigger group will come down. So your trigger plate itself doesn't actually have anything attached to it, which is kind of cool because this is not going to be done again, right? Every other shotgun that comes after this, all of the guts will be on the trigger group. As far as I'm aware, that's how every shotgun after this, the direction it wanted to go, is to have the guts on the trigger group. But very cool to see this one. It's, again, kind of Mauser style, like the bottom metal on a Mauser. There's at least a little bit of similarity there. I'm not going to say that that's where he got it, but again, it's similar. It was definitely clear that he had seen a Mauser at any rate. Here is our spring for the connector, and there's the connector itself. You will note this connector is repaired because this is another one of the parts on this gun that just loves to break itself. But with it in our hand here, we can see that it has a little hook on it, and that hook is going to interact with that foot there on the sear, like so, where that hook will latch into that foot, and that's what pulls the striker down. And because this can rotate this way, right, the sear can push past it until it locks into place, and then you can pull it down, and then the gun will fire, and then this snaps back into the way, right? It's sort of this can rock this way and then get pulled down by the trigger. It rocks to get out of the way of the sear reciprocating on the bolt. It pulls down to disengage the sear from the striker. Pretty simple there. But we can set our sear back where it goes, set our connector here with its spring. At this point remaining in the gun, we have our trigger, our safety mechanism, and our elevator mechanism. We also have this piece, which I can really only dub the multifunctional piece. Getting it out of the gun just involves dragging it to the front. Right, it's that piece with that little round knob that the bolt sat on before. So you drag it to the front and it will sort of fall into the receiver and then down out of the bottom. Once it's out of the gun, the elevator, the carrier will want to spring up like this. You can just remove the carrier from the gun with this screw. So we'll go ahead and do that here. This screw will have a little bit of resistance to it because it's holding the carrier on and the carrier is spring loaded. But if it gives you any trouble, you can always flip the receiver over and then tap the screw out. Just like that. We'll take our punch back, please. And with a little wiggling, the carrier will come loose. And it will slide past the trigger. There's the spring for the carrier, a little complicated torsion spring guy. There's the carrier itself. We will note that the carrier has a separate piece on it here, and that piece is sprung by the torsion spring as well. So this torsion spring is responsible for this springing of the carrier. It's also responsible for springing this unit here. We'll be able to see as we're reassembling the gun the importance of this piece here and how it's going to interact with this multifunctional piece here to actually facilitate the flippy-uppy of the carrier in order to facilitate loading. But for now, we can show off that this piece is separate, right? It does take off like that, which is kind of interesting. Again, we're not going to detail strip the little finger here off of the carrier, but there's a solid pin. You can just punch that out, and then you have this little flappy finger off of there. Whenever the gun is more assembled, we'll be able to show you what this flappy finger is actually doing. The way this flappy finger works is it actually locks against the front of the trigger group. So if you can imagine this being assembled in the gun, there's this ledge here on the trigger group. See if I can highlight that in contrast against the paper towel maybe. There at the tip of my finger, there's that ledge. The tip of the flippy finger is going to lock against that ledge. Whenever the tippy finger gets pushed in, the carrier can then spring up, be pushed up, like so. Whenever the flippy finger is not pressed, it locks in against the trigger group. So pressed, it can swing up and down. Not pressed, locked in. With that understood, we'll set our trigger group there, set our carrier over there. And with our multifunctional piece, we'll again showcase that round part there. It's going to sit in the round part here on the bolt group. As the bolt group reciprocates, it's going to reciprocate this with it. This has a little T-slot on it that it rides on the inside of the receiver. We can show you that better in a moment, but that's how those two ride together there. Final thing to deal with here on the gun is our trigger. It just comes out on its own little screw. Removed there. That's certainly a very funky looking screw. It has a big fat section on it here, then a section the trigger rides on, then it's threads to actually hold it in. We'll set it there. And here's our trigger itself. The trigger is actually a pretty darn simple, I mean it's big obviously, but it's a pretty darn simple part at the end of the day. It does not have its own spring because it just relies on the spring from the connector. The way that the trigger actually interacts with the connector is like so. This big ledge there on the connector, the trigger pulls it like that, pulls it down. So there's how that happens, but otherwise the trigger is just sort of held there in the gun, not doing a whole lot. And I guess I forgot to mention that as far as the function of this connector, it does also work as a disconnector. Whenever the trigger pulls this down, it will stay in that downwards position as the sear, of course it gets pulled down, right? It fires the gun. The bolt will come back, the bolt will come forward. Once you release the trigger, it will let the connector come up and the connector will snap over it like so. So regardless of if you're pulling the bolt back and then letting the bolt go forward, it will either push the connector over and latch it onto the foot, or if the trigger was previously pulled, right, bang, it dropped the striker is going to snap back up to catch the sear. It's going to go backwards, it's going to go forwards. Releasing the trigger, this will then snap up this way. I think the function of the connector is pretty slick. However, the size of the feet that engage between the connector and the sear are really, really small and can be the root of light strike or no fire or inconsistent reset problems with these guns. But we'll set all those pieces to the side. The final thing that we have to dally with on this gun is the safety. You have this arm here. This arm sort of connects the tang. As the tang moves forward and back, that moves this arm forward and back. Whenever this arm is in the backwards position, it blocks movement of the trigger. Whenever it's in the forward position, it doesn't block movement of the trigger. It's pretty simple. And then removing the safety, it's just this arm there. It's a flat spring to give it a little bit of clicky detent positivity. And the safety itself is there. And at this point, there's a stripped Sjogren receiver. There's like non-disassemblable parts of it that you could take apart further, but obviously we're not going to do that because they're not meant to be taken apart. But for example, the stud that the ejector pushes against is not an integral part. And then finally, you have a little spring here on the receiver that's not meant to come off, that just sort of facilitates loading of the magazine, right? You'll pop a shell over this spring to help retain it into the gun. But at this point, we have taken the thing all the way apart. We've discussed in brief detail the way everything works. As we're putting the gun back together, we'll go ahead and talk about how feeding works, because that's really the one thing that we've missed at this point, is how the actual feeding cycle of the thing happens. And that's because the feeding discussion is sort of a necessary part of the troubleshooting discussion, so I'm kind of going to mix those both up into one. As we're reassembling, we'll start touching on those troubleshooting items. We'll hit feeding on the way out the door on that troubleshooting discussion, and then we'll move into the shooting section of the video. So bear with us. It's probably going to get a little bit more tedious as we go through here and talk about reassembly and troubleshooting at the same time, but I think that's the best way to handle this. going right back into things, we will reassemble our safety the same way it just came off the gun. And so we'll take this bar, and remember the short end is going to go into the tang, the long end does not. Push it down, click it into the spring, and then it's just going to fold flat like that. Nothing really important to talk about there. I guess minor troubleshooting item that we already sort of touched on with how the connector and the trigger and the sear work together. Of course, the size of those feet is important. If the foot is damaged or broken off of either of them, like, you know, I guess the tooth there, the tooth there, if either of those are damaged or broken off, that would explain non-functioning states of either of these parts. So that would be probably the first thing to investigate there, as far as like a trigger that doesn't want to reset, or a trigger that doesn't want to pull, or as you pull a trigger it clicks but doesn't drop the striker. That is a chief indication of there's not enough material left on either one of these two hooks, or something is preventing them from interacting correctly. So first thing to do would be check on those. Besides that, I haven't really run into any big problems with these three parts, so we can go ahead and start putting them back into the gun. Get our screw to line up with the hole in the trigger. Struggle as hard as we can with this screw, trying to get it to line up with a hole in the trigger. There it is. And at this point we will fasten it. With the trigger reinstalled, the next part to put in the gun is going to be the elevator, and this is always a very enjoyable experience with trying to get this torsion spring down into the gun, compressed just right, that you can get the pin through. It's like the most evil version of getting an AR-15's hammer to line up just right. And the important thing to remember is that this leg, like the longer leg of this spring, is going to go underneath this stud here. You do not want to have it on top of the stud, because that will not work correctly. And then the short leg is going to go down. There's a corresponding slot there in the bottom of the receiver. If you've got a gun in front of you, it will be very obvious. I'm not sure how well the camera is going to pick up that there's a slot there, sort of behind where the trigger sits. But we will set the carrier down into the gun. You have to guide it around the trigger there. And then once it's getting close, it's just a matter of forcing it into position and getting this screw through the hole. That's the easiest that's ever gone for me. Usually that's a good 10-minute fight. Now the question will be if it will line up well enough that it will start threading into the other side. I think it might be. Well, there you go. There's proof that it's actually really easy to do. If you guys struggle with it more than I did, it's because you're not good at what you're doing or something. There we go. That screw is good and tight. And now the carrier should move freely. Important thing to inspect at this point is that it should move freely. If you let it snap all the way up, sometimes the spring can come out of its slot, so try to avoid letting it come all the way up. The easiest way to do that is to reinstall this piece. As a reminder, it sort of like installs wonkily into the front of the receiver. You can pass it up from the bottom. There's a T-slot there in the receiver that it rides in, front and back. But just to show you guys, the correct orientation is with the round knob to the front and up. So it will go in like this. And you can just sort of set it into the receiver there. And it has just enough, it's just barely able to fit in there. Like so. And then once you pass it backwards, I guess before you pass it backwards, make sure that the carrier is pushed up into the gun. And there's that bottom protrusion there on that multifunction piece, as I've been calling it. It will latch the carrier down. So there the carrier can spring up. But if we pass our multifunction piece back, you should be able to see it moving front and back there. You can use it to latch the carrier down. This multifunction piece is primarily responsible for feeding. I think we've already mentioned that. We'll showcase in a little bit more detail about how specifically it does that here in a moment, because what we really need to do that is the bolt group. I just realized something we forgot to take out of the gun. There's this guy. Let's not forget this guy. He's responsible for actually providing the spring force to the outer bolt shell here. It has a little claw, and that claw is going to lock against that slot there on the bolt group. And then his actual job is for the recoil spring to push on him there. I don't know how we forgot that. We'll pay particular attention to him whenever we're putting him back into the gun so that everybody is fully aware of the fact that that is a piece that goes in this gun. It's not infrequent to see guns that are missing that piece because that piece doesn't come out with the spring, and you can just like invert your receiver and it falls on the floor and you forgot that it exists. That's how I learned that these guns have that piece, is I dropped it on the floor and then came back like a day later and was like, huh, that gun's got the same, that part has the same serial number as that gun that I just put back together that didn't work right anymore. That's weird. So that's what that's from. But as I was saying, to understand how the carrier works a little better, we will pull this little multifunction knob most of the way back, and we will set the bolt group down on top of it. And at this point, we can push the bolt group forward. Now, because the carrier is no longer being retained, right, our carrier is going to flop free. The important thing to remember is that it's actually the trigger plate here that sets the downward movement limit for the carrier. So we're going to pretend that this is reinstalled, but we're going to leave it off so we can see what's going on. Now, the feeding cycle on this gun, if we get one of our hyper-realistic snap caps here, right, the magazine is going to have shells located here. You really have two shell stops in this gun, right? The spring sort of acts as a shell stop, but additionally you have a little rounded cut on that multifunction piece. And the case rim of shells is actually going to lock against that, like so. Whenever the bolt group comes all the way forward, shells are going to lock against that, right? Like so. All right, so if I push backwards on this shell, it's going to push backwards on the bolt because of that rounded cut on that multifunction piece. Now, when the gun is fired, of course, the carrier is going to be in this position here, sort of waiting to receive a shell. The shell isn't going to be able to be pushed backwards because this multifunction piece is in the way, but okay, now the gun has cycled, right? The bolt is going to be pulled backwards. The magazine spring is going to start pushing the shell backwards as well. The bolt group will continue rearwards, and if you note right there at the tip of my pinky is that rear lug on the multifunction piece. It's going to click. Remember we saw that this piece of the carrier can rotate out of the way. It's going to click past that piece and then start trying to come forward. However, remember we talked that middle finger locks into the trigger group on that little protrusion right there. It's going to be locked on that protrusion until the shell can come all the way out of the magazine and then push on that finger. So we can see the shell coming backwards out of the magazine pushes that finger. Once the shell comes back and pushes that finger, the carrier is now released to spring upwards. Because this multifunction piece has a wedge shape on it, and because the action spring is pushing the bolt group forward, the bolt group is going to push forward, and then watch what happens to the carrier. All I'm going to be doing is pushing forward on the bolt. Did you see it? The carrier springs up and then back down. And the way that actually works is that multifunction piece, that little protrusion, that tooth that it has on the back of it, as the bolt gets pushed forward, that tooth is going to ride forward, cam the carrier up to let the bolt group get the round off of the elevator, and then once the tooth gets to this protrusion there, that little rectangular cutout, the carrier is going to flop back down. And then the gun will close up, it'll lock, and it'll be ready for the next round. This is the feeding cycle of the Sjogren. It is also the thing that on this gun will jam and cause the most problems. It's not an uncommon thing for these guns where the bolt grip will come to the back and it will hang up and the bolt grip has to be tapped forward in order for the gun to try and cycle again. In order for the gun to be able to cycle, the bolt has to be assisted forwards. It's not an uncommon thing. Ultimately, the reason it has these problems is because there is too much friction between the multifunction part and the carrier, or there is not enough spring force from the action spring on the bolt group, or the bolt group has too much drag relative to the rails on the receiver, or something else is rubbing inside of the reciprocating parts of the gun that causes too much excess friction. Because this spring, this way too small of a spring, your action spring, is all of the assist that you have to lift that carrier up on a mechanically disadvantaged cam working against a rather strong torsion spring to lift up the carrier and a live shell, and have the bolt have enough energy to get forward to close on this shell. That's asking quite a bit of a 6mm diameter spring that's not very long and can't have very thick coils because it has to compress a long distance. This is the root of most of the problems that these guns end up having then, is this spring isn't really well thought out. I had previously mentioned, if we start taking a couple of pieces back apart here, I had previously mentioned that it is important to have a new stiff spring in place for your ejector. The reason for this is because this ejector spring gets compressed against that knob whenever the gun is in the full recoiled position. Because of this, you actually get a little bit of extra spring assistance to get the bolt moving forwards, which is that place that it usually hangs up. This gun had those typical hang-up problems until I replaced the spring. It has it running substantially more reliable. Interestingly, my problems with these guns, sort of skipping ahead to the conclusion of this video, I've replaced a lot of the parts in this gun. I had to make a new one of those multifunction pieces. That one that's in the gun currently, I machined by hand. As mentioned, this part has been replaced. A couple of the other pieces on this gun I've either had to fit or deburr or repair. Lots of springs I've had to remake because it's not like you can get spring kits for these things, because these guns really, really don't want to work. But through that whole cycle of trying to get this one to work better, well enough to at least show off on video to show this is what one looks like when it works, I had got the gun to the point that if you held the gun level, it would cycle 90%, 95% of the time. And it wasn't until I was shooting it at clay birds, right, where the gun's going to be elevated a little bit, it started hanging up on feeding and wouldn't do it again. And no matter what combination of spring I tried here, it just would not work until I replaced this spring here, because this is quite a bit stiffer than the actual recoil spring, because it doesn't have quite as much stroke. It doesn't need as much stroke. And as a result, this little bit of added spring force was what it took for the gun to be elevated at a 45 and still be capable of getting the bolt to go forward and lift the carrier and lift a shell and cycle reliably. So these guns are a little bit of a mess, and that's probably the best troubleshooting tip there, is that if your gun's hanging up at the back, replace the spring if you can, because that might just get your problems worked out. But if not, the gun likes to be clean, it likes to be oiled, it likes to be greased on all of the sliding surfaces, it likes to have as stiff of a recoil spring as you can get away with, because the gun's just like a weird nightmare scenario of balancing spring weights. And I guess that's sort of the cool thing, is this spring weight is balanced against this spring weight. This spring and this spring are balanced against the torsion spring for the carrier, as well as the weight of the carrier. It's just a very interesting system, the way that the springs all have to battle each other. And that back in 1905, when spring making, I'm sure, was not even remote, I'm sure they didn't have McMaster. They couldn't get online and just order springs off of McMaster and find one that worked. They had to figure all this stuff out, and that is pretty impressive. But with all that said, we're ready to continue putting pieces of this gun back together. We can get our connector and its spring, put the spring on the connector. I always like to pass the connector up into the gun. Remember, it sits in this sort of rectangular hole. I like to pass it in first, then get the carrier sat down, then have the multifunction piece retain the carrier so that we don't have to be fighting it, and then set the trigger group down on top. But as we're setting the trigger group down, that hole there has to line up with the connector, which can be a little tricky. We'll see if we can't get it here. And you can use you can see I'm manipulating the connector there. You can hold the receiver like this and then use your middle finger to manipulate the connector around to try and get it to line up. And it never ever quite wants to right away. There we go. That's got it. And then once you get it like that, hold that trigger group on there and don't let it come off, and stick some screws back in it. I have found that if you install the, of the two short screws, right, you have two short screws, one coming either side, install the one on the right first and get it tight. The reason to do this is it will make for a slightly less drag on the carrier if you install this one first, because the carrier will rub, I guess we can sort of see it here, the carrier will rub on this side of the trigger group. However, if you put this screw in first, it will pull the trigger group slightly closer to this wall of the receiver. Whenever we put this screw in, then it will be, the trigger group will be biased this way a little bit for a little bit less drag. But we can then put this screw in the back. And then finally one screw up here. With these screws, I would probably recommend you use Loctite. Whenever I'm finally done taking this gun apart all the time, like whenever I know that the gun finally works reliably, and I'm done making videos with it, and then I can just like throw it in a closet and then wish that it was never invented, I will probably Loctite these screws. I recommend you do it on yours because these screws do come loose as a result of firing, right? These screws will vibrate loose. They probably should have had lock screws on them, but again, this is one of those sort of guns where it's a prototype that saw 5,000 examples made. I don't consider its production serial production quite in the way that we would for most other guns, because this is not a mature design by any stretch of the imagination. But at this point, we can move our multifunction piece around, put it in its backwards position because that's where we're going to need it next. But at this point, we can set the receiver group to the side. That subassembly is put back together. We now have an entire bolt subassembly to put back together. As we explained before, these springs are fragile, so be very careful with them. It's my personal preference to make this the last thing taken out of the bolt group and the last thing put back in, because that guarantees that as you're trying to put the striker in there and compressing it to spin the thing in, you're never snapping the striker down onto the sear. I just worry about how fragile that sear is because of how fragile it looks, and then also how fragile the spring is. So we like to keep those safe and out of the way to minimize impact on them. Our first step in reassembly here is going to be to take our little detent. And remember, of course, if you took the spring out, the spring goes in before the detent. For the love of everything, do not put the detent in there before you put the spring in there, or else you're going to be like fishing in there with a magnet or trying to blow compressed air in there, or just you're going to have a really bad day. Because like other things on this bolt group, they loved blind holes because they really didn't want you working on your gun. But with that reinstalled, you then take the safety flag with the flag pointed off this direction, depress the detent, and then you can rotate it back around, and then make sure that it clicks and clicks. That means that your detent is doing its good job. If your detent is less clicky than this, I would recommend replacing it, because otherwise you're going to end up like me with a gun that's got a chip of metal out of there. Certainly the pieces of steel in this gun beating together aren't good, because another takeaway that we'll talk about maybe more in the conclusion is these guns were not made out of the best quality steel. Because it was 1905 and material sciences and processes were just then beginning to get to the point that they were relatively standardized, and that alloy steels had grades and things that you could call them instead of it just being, I don't know, this stuff seems like it's okay. But all that complaining aside, we've got our bolt group here. We can take our striker. I say this because I've forgotten it before. Do not put the striker back into the gun without the drive spring, or else you have to take everything back apart, and that's no fun. The other thing you want to make a note of is that the striker should have a straight up and down position. I ended up scratching it into the finish on this one just so it was a little bit more obvious, but of course you've got your through hole for that pin. That through hole for the pin is going to be going this way, just like how we drifted the pin out. My witness mark is for straight up and down. The reason for this is because, of course, the flag has corresponding holes, and you're going to have to tighten these into each other and then get that pinhole to line up exactly straight, which can be a little haphazard. So I leave myself a little nice witness mark there so I can see what I'm doing. But reassembly is pretty much just like we disassembled it. We will take these pieces, stick that inside of there, and at this point we'll get our piece of steel, jab ourselves in the chest again. So I gave up doing it on my stomach. It's a little bit difficult in order to get the witness mark to line up. So we're going to do it on the table. I'm pretty sure you guys are familiar with what these shapes look like by now, but we're just compressing the striker to get it to stick out there, taking our flag, getting it started. Once you've got it started, you can take a little break. This striker spring is just unbelievably stiff. but we'll just go around and around, and eventually we'll get things to line up. We can see as we've been tightening this, my witness mark is now off, so we'll just have to pay attention to that to try and get it to straighten back out. You can get the witness mark to move around by just compressing the bolt group and sort of rotating it. I just got it pretty much straightened back out there. Ordinarily, the striker flag will be flush with the rear end of the striker. For some reason, at some point, somebody machined material off the back of my striker flag. I couldn't even begin to guess why, but that means that mine has to be screwed in a little bit further than you'd ordinarily see. So if you're there working on your gun, yours may not look like mine. But you'll compress it and spin and compress it and spin until you can get light through the pinhole there. Once you've got light from the pinhole, you need to do your best to decide, does it need to go in another half turn further, or is it okay where it is? And in my case, I've got to go a half turn further, which is good, because I'll be able to show you guys what it looks like when everything sucks. So ours is going to be about there. Yep, and now I've got a full daylight through the pinhole. So what I'm going to do now is drive the pin back through. Then what I'm going to have to do is rotate the striker 180 degrees to get it to line up correctly. So to show you guys all of that, we will sit back down, put this to the side for the moment, get our little pin, see if we can't get it started and sent home. For reinstallation, you can use a little punch block pretty well. Still want to rotate a little bit on me. Probably just the pinhole is ever so slightly misaligned, and I just want to see if I can't just tap it on in. And as you're doing this, the striker flag can also try and rotate on you, which is cool. But there we go. Got the pin to go in halfway. At this point, it's just a game of pounding on it a little more. It's still wanting to fight me just a little bit. Making sure everything's still going in straight. Try one more time here. And eventually, with enough persuasion, you'll get that pin to be in there. Now, at this point, what you can do is rotate the striker flag. And here's the fire position. We will rotate it to the safe position. And what we need to do is now compress the striker and then rotate it so that the flags sort of tip there. I know I keep calling two different things the flag, right? You have the flag that's sort of the recocker. I'll try and keep calling that the recocker for now. The bit there on the end of the striker, I'm going to keep calling the flag. It's, it's really like the sear edge of the striker, but we need to rotate it so it has, its vertical protrusion is facing straight up and down. Currently it's facing this way. We want to rotate it so it's facing that way. So we will get our pipe. This I might just be able to hold against my body for it. And now we're going to rotate and rotate and rotate. Maybe just a little bit further. There we go. And it will slide down into its position. At this point, we can make sure that it works correctly. You'll know it's working correctly because with quite a bit of force, you can now rotate the cocking flag, right? The safety cocking flag. You can rotate up into position and it will pull the striker back. However, because the sear is not currently inserted, rotating this down will let the striker come forwards. So what we'll do at this point is cock it so it's in the rearward position. We will be very careful to not bump the flag, right? We don't want to let the striker snap down on accident while we're doing this, but we'll be careful to not bump the flag at all. We'll take our breech bolt. We will reinsert our spring. The spring is U-shaped. The tips are going to go down, if that makes sense. So if this is the U shape, it's going to go like that. So there's our U. It's going like this, down into the gun. We then take our sear, and the correct way to insert it, there's the hole for the screw that's going to retain it. This little flat there is going to go against the spring, so it's going to drop in like this. And then we're just going to pass this screw through. You'll have to compress the sear just slightly against its spring to get this spring to pass past it. But then once you've done that, you're pretty much home free. Just reinstall this screw. And while this screw is not one that you want to have break, I do still tighten this screw a little bit more than I normally would for a lot of things like this, because this screw does want to vibrate loose. And if it vibrates loose, remember, this is the only thing that's keeping your striker cocked back. It's certainly not something you want to have come loose. So with that reinstalled, we're all set there. And now we can gently lower the striker. And at this point, the striker is cocked to its rear-end position, and we know that everything is hunky-dory here. We will be able to function test it later once this is reinstalled on the gun. At this point, we are ready to get our bolt group reinstalled onto the receiver. Although, I guess in order to do that, we do have the one sub-assembly step of getting the ejector back on. So getting the ejector back on the gun is never a lot of fun. I found that using a pick tool to try and help compress this spring will sometimes give you a little bit of an advantage, because you've got this round peg there on the base of the ejector that has to go into this hole, and then it has to sort of flop to the front of the gun. And so the tricky part with this technique is, so we're going to have to take this tool out and then compress the ejector further forwards. And I think I've already lost my grip on it. We'll see if we can do this one more time. So we'll compress this spring, get the ejector started, just like so. Now we're going to pop this tool out, and now we have to pull the ejector a little further forward to get it to the front of the bolt, just like that. And this is not something easy to do, but then sort of ease it over to its slot, and it can help to put just a little bit of oil, because these parts are dragging across each other, and that's not ideal, but get a little bit of oil on them. It can help to push forward here on the base of the ejector just a little bit, because now all we have to do is try and align it with the slot, like so. There we go. Ejector's back in the gun, and then you can push on the rear end of it just to make sure it moves freely. You can hear our spring. Our spring wants to click just because the spring's a tight fit in the hole, but it is working properly with plenty of force. There's that. Set it to the side. We can now take our locking block, mate it back up with the bolt. This is another thing, benefits from oil and grease. We already wiped some of the excess off, so we'll just apply a little bit more. Set that there. Make sure that these lock inside of each other and move freely. Another place that can use grease is here at the front, because it'll be tight there. There we go. So now the bolt group, this round hole is going to sit down on top of the round dowel on the multifunction part. However, we locked the multifunction part all the way to the back. Whenever it's locked all the way to the back, of course, we have to depress the carrier to get the multifunction part to move forward again. And what you'll do is move it forward about that far. It's also about the time that the multifunction part will make a click sound as it moves forward on the carrier. And you just go forward a little bit more than that, and then the bolt group here can swing in and out freely. Don't try and force it, right? That's the secret. If you try and force it, you will break something. These pieces will fit together without any forcing needing to take place. If you're forcing something, you're probably doing it wrong. So there's that. We can then take our bolt shroud itself. What I like to do, a little bit of oil about midway up the rails there on the receiver, which this will then be able to go and slide on. You will then slide the outer shell over the bolt group. The bolt group has to be perfectly centered. Just go ahead and wiggle and everything will get going. So at this point we're going to take our little U-shaped piece, set it down on top of the bolt group, and we want it to go in straight. So you can start one leg, but then what you'll want to do after you start one leg is hold it and then start the other one. So let's see if we can't demonstrate a good way of installing this. So there's one leg started. Of course, it started a little too far. There it is. Now we're going to have our thumb hold this leg as we start the other one. Now they're both started. At this point, just tap in the middle, and it'll go down. Tap a little bit more, and it'll go down the rest of the way. You do not need to use a steel hammer and a great big punch to get this lock seated. If you do that, you're going to risk breaking it. You don't want it to go in crooked, right? Go one leg at a time, and again, don't force it. I did not have to smack very hard, and this is just a rubber hammer. You don't have to go nuts. Going nuts is how stuff breaks at this point. But now we can make sure that the bolt group moves smoothly. We can pull it all the way to the rear, and at this point, again, it'll be locked against the carrier. We can push the carrier up just to make sure everything slides relatively smoothly, and it does. So we know thus far we've done everything right. We can take this lock, set it back down in there. At this point, it's really up to you. You can install the recoil spring. I guess we can go ahead and do that just for fun. Of course, before we install the recoil spring, right, I almost forgot it. This part goes in first. The little claw shape on it, right, it's sort of got this claw going on. The thumb on the claw is going to face straight down, right, so it's going to face this direction as we insert it. And how I like to insert it is with the gun rotated like this. Then we can take the spring and use it to push it in the rest of the way. And you're going to be looking in this slot here for whenever that claw becomes visible. So looking in this slot there, we will push the spring forward, and we're able to see right there in that slot, that claw is now like this, right? So there's the claw, here's the thumb, it's now in there like that. We will push the bolt all the way forward, and then use the spring to push the claw all the way forward, and the thumb on the claw will automatically stick up and grab in the front slot on the bolt group. You do not want it to grab in the back slot of the bolt group, that will cause trouble. It grabs in the front slot. Now, with that installed, we can then take our recoil spring and this screw and then retain it. And remember, as we'd previously discussed, this is sort of my solution for this recoil spring because nobody really sells new recoil springs for this gun. Your recoil spring shouldn't be, a washer and an extra stiff spring and a regular spring. One regular spring is the way this gun is meant to be, but I found that this, the added tension that comes from this extra spacing plus the buffer zone gives me peace of mind and a more reliable gun. And so I went with this particular system. And at this point, we'll just compress that and then screw this screw in, like so. And at this point, what you'll want to make sure is that the bolt group moves without excess drag. You'll be able to hear a little bit of drag, and that's usually from that claw-shaped thing. You can actually just squirt a little bit of oil down into that hole. Oil that up there. Additional lubrication spots include right here underneath this rail on the receiver, and again on the other side. And this gun does like to be heavily lubricated. Once we've sort of wiped it around, we can take the excess off, because of course we don't need it dripping, but wet is good. Make sure everything moves okay there. At this point, we are ready to reinstall the stock on the gun, which will be the lock there, then the stock itself. And remember, spring needs to be in there whenever you're putting the stock on. So the stock's going to go on like that. I'm going to take our screw for the stock, stick it in there, and then while holding the stock compressed, we'll spin this screw in. And once the threads are started, we don't really have to worry about it. We're about compressing it anymore. And we can just tighten it up. Like so. There's our stock on there nice and tight. And again, make sure the bolt group moves smooth. Of course, the only thing about the bolt group that would work differently now is that there's usually a little wear scar behind this lump. Make sure that you can pull the bolt group back, and by hand, pull it back as far as it'll go. and make sure that the whole wear scar can disappear underneath that rear lump there. If it can't, then your recoil spring's too long or you've put something in the gun incorrectly. The gun should be able to push that little block back far enough that the whole wear scar behind it is hidden underneath it, because that means that you're getting a full recoil stroke out of the gun. If you're not getting a full recoil stroke out of the gun, and the gun is hanging up before that block bottoms out against the trigger group, something else is what's arresting the bolt, and that something else might break if it bottoms out, right? So that's the easy check there. Every time you take the gun apart or put it back together, make sure of that wear scar gets hidden whenever you take the bolt group like this and pull it all the way back towards you. Pretty easy thing to check. But there's that. And again, push on that finger to have the bolt group come forwards. And at this point, we're going to reassemble the barrel front end group and then talk very briefly about troubleshooting the feeding of the gun. Reassembly of the front end of the gun is pretty much just the reverse of how we took it apart. We will take this group here. I guess if your gun has trouble feeding, right, it will sometimes not kick a shell out. One thing to inspect is that here on the interrupted thread side, make sure that a shell can pass cleanly through the tube. One thing that happens with these guns, because of how they take down, people will not pull this magazine tube out all the way and will then try rotating the barrel off, and that can crush the end of this tube down a little bit. Trying to correct that crush in a vise, I'm not very confident on. You can try and pass a mandrel back through there, but the metal is so thin it will just deform around the mandrel and then come back to the size, the crushed size that it was. So the thing that I recommend, or the thing that I had to do on this gun anyway, was just take a little bit of sand. I guess I took a 3D printed tool to find the areas that it was out of round. And on my particular gun, that was the sides opposite. So there's the interrupted thread side. Here's the positions opposite it. Here is where it was crushed in. And so what I did was just take some sandpaper and sanded, and just made sure that, I took like 20 shells or whatever, and then made sure that you could just take a shell from the top, twist it. There's no hang up, no dragging, no binding, and that you can just drop it through. And make sure that that's the case for 25 shells in a row, and you'll be all set. That's probably the easiest way, right, to deal with the issue of being too tight there. But assuming that you don't have that issue, or you've solved that issue, you can reassemble the magazine. Go ahead and stick the follower in there. It will sometimes hang up here at the very back because it's not meant to really go past there except for assembly and disassembly. We'll pass the spring forward. And again, remember the reason I said that the weak magazine spring is important? The troubleshooting reason for that is, as we sort of showed, right, the shells push against that multifunction piece, and that multifunction piece touches the bolt. Especially if you've got a full magazine, if the bolt's just being held slightly backwards, and it's being held backwards enough that whenever you pull the trigger, it doesn't drop the striker. Instead, it just sort of makes this clicking sound. It goes like click, 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 but doesn't pull the striker. The reason for that is, especially with a full magazine, if the mag spring is too stiff, the shells that are pushing back on that multifunction piece will actually hold the bolt slightly out of battery, and the gun can't really fire out of battery. So that's really the reason that's happening, and the way to get around that is either a stiffer action spring or a weaker magazine spring. But you don't want the magazine spring to be too weak, or else that will introduce a series of other feeding issues. Again, as I explained, these guns are just a balancing nightmare of spring weights. But we can go ahead, reinstall the cap here. And then there's our hole. Got to find where it lines up, which is right there. Take our little bitty screw, and we need our smallest, bravest screwdriver bit. There's the one. And we can reinstall that screw. And this is one that would, again, be good to get pretty snug, because if this one falls off, you're in for a bad time. But this is certainly one that's small enough that if you're not paying attention, you could break that screw off. It's not very big, so be conservative in getting it tighter than you think it needs to, if that makes any sense. That probably means nothing. But at this point, we'll take our barrel. Every time I've got the handguard off, I like to take a little bit of preservative oil and rub it underneath where the handguard goes, because these guns can rust pretty badly underneath the handguards, because the handguard is right up tight on the barrel. Especially if you live somewhere humid, that's a good idea. But there's that. But with that done, we can take the wood. It slots in at the back hanger, and then the front hanger slips over it like so. And then once that's all tight, you will pull the front hanger towards you and then tighten the screw on it. Make sure we get the appropriate bit for that. That one's just a little bit loose. That one's okay. So we will pull the hanger towards ourselves and then tighten it down. There we go. And that should give you a pretty wiggle-free handguard. However, usually that front hanger will settle just a little bit and then the handguard will have just a little wobble. But take our magazine tube. It's got this track on it. This is the track that it uses for disassembly. Make it so that the long part of this track lines up there with this screw hole. And we will set the screw down in there. See if this is the right tip. It is not. Flop that over. Get a more appropriate screwdriver. That's the one. And go ahead and get this screw tightened down. And again, make sure that the magazine tube can move free the whole time. And get this screw snugged up, because this is another screw that you do not want coming loose. But once it's tightened up, we can take our magazine tube, make sure that it can push all the way in and then rotate. And then of course you've got this little spring-loaded plunger that locks it into position. But now finally, on our last little troubleshooting item here before we get to feeding, is the barrel to receiver fitment. In general, the way this works is you use a screwdriver to loosen this screw. Once this screw is loosened, you can see this little, I guess, funny looking guy there. Once the screw is all the way out, rather, not just loosened, but take the screw out, you can use a pick tool to back this little guy off. You can see it's like a different rectangle there. Once that tab is sort of removed, once it's pulled backwards, the interrupted thread segment here on the barrel can thread in and out, right? So you can thread it on or thread it off to increase or decrease the amount of free play between your front end of your gun and your receiver. Once you have your gun in front of you, you'll definitely be able to see that this locking claw has two teeth. It locks into corresponding teeth on here, so you can rotate it like one tooth at a time, one tooth at a time, one tooth at a time to sort of adjust the fitment between your front end and your back end of your gun. Much like the Winchesters, this can be a little bit fiddly. Ordinarily threading it in will make it tighter until you hit a certain point, at which point threading it backwards would make it tighter, simply because it's interrupted threads. That's sort of the nature of it. By the time you've gone one full phase, it's no longer interfacing with the same thread on the receiver, and now you're back where you sort of started. As an absolute last resort, if you can't quite get it to be completely firm by adjusting here, you can always get brass shims and install them either here or here to make it so that things are very tight. But if you make the choice to go with shims, you will have to replace those shims every so often if you are actually taking your barrel off over and over. That said, with the Sjogren, even though it is a takedown gun, you do not have to take the barrel off to take the rest of the guts out. The rest of the guts can come out with the barrel on. So if after fiddling with the locking collar you just can't get the gun to hold together tight, you're not out of luck. Move to shims. You can get a shim that fits again on the shoulder here, or sort of where the chamber would. That's sort of how you put shims on, like 1897s will use that same mechanism. But using some amount of brass shims to tighten up that fitment is an option, because having any amount of wobble between the front and back of your gun just feels terrible. But on this gun, I was able to just adjust it until it fit correctly. And just to show you guys, reassembly there, you put the barrel in, you rotate it, you make sure the magazine tube is pulled all the way back as you rotate, because you don't want to crush your magazine tube. It will click over into position, you push your mag tube in, you rotate it, the spring-loaded detent will pop out, and now you've got your gun reassembled. And our handguard has already picked up a little wobble, but our barrel to receiver fit is dead tight, and that's what you want to see. And now we're finally ready for that discussion on feeding troubleshooting. So the most common failure that you'll have with this gun, as we've already sort of alluded to, is the bolt will lock to the back and it will not feed its next shell. Now the usual causes of this really just comes down to a spring imbalance. Either your action spring doesn't have enough force, or your carrier spring is too strong. Not that I recommend you try weakening your carrier spring. Really the way to correct that spring imbalance is a stronger action spring, or there's excess drag somewhere else in your gun. If you detail strip your gun like mine and all of the pieces look correct and they're all assembled correctly, you can generally rule out excess friction unless like your carrier, you feel a lot of drag, or your bolt group moving it forward back, you have a lot of drag, or your multifunction part, right, if it has a lot of drag too. Those would be indications that something might need to be addressed. But if all of those pieces are installed correctly, not a lot of drag there, usually what it comes down to is not enough force from the action spring. If you've already got a new action spring in your gun and you really don't think that you can get more spring force out of there, the thing that I recommend you do is replace your ejector spring. A stronger ejector spring will help you. What you want your gun to be able to do is that with the gun pointed upwards, all you have to do is push on the finger and the bolt will go forward. You do not want to have to help push up on the carrier in order to assist it. So as just a little quick, bench test, right, a cold test without having to fire the gun to see if your gun is likely to be able to cycle reliably, just push up on the finger and the bolt should go forward all the way on its own. If you push up on the finger and it just sort of hangs up, of course I can't make mine do it because mine's working correctly, but say you push on this finger and the bolt just does that. It just hangs up a little bit and you have to nudge it forward to get it to go. Start looking at the springs, start looking at excess drag, start looking at that sort of stuff. That is the most common feeding issue that you'll run into on this gun, by far and away. Pretty much all of the guns that I think I've seen or talked to people who own have had this jam happen. It seems that it's just sort of the way these guns work, is that there's just not quite enough spring force to get it forward sometimes. And of course, having it upright gives it the most disadvantage, similar to whenever, like if you're holding it at a 45-degree angle, for example, right? So you just shot at a bird at a 45-degree angle, and the gun's now trying to feed on its own, right? You could do that sort of a test by just having a shell sit there on the carrier and then touch the finger, and it should be capable of popping up on its own. The other way to do this test is just to pop one round in there, and then you can pull the bolt back, and the gun will usually not feed just that one last round at the time. And the gun will usually not feed that one last round. It will usually need the button pushed, right, because the magazine spring ordinarily throws this shell backwards at the button and will hit the button and then make it feed sort of in like the usual timing cycle of this gun. But if you just put one shell in there, it usually won't go on its own. But you should have the gun at a 45 and just have to touch the finger, not push up on the carrier, and it should be capable of cycling. And you could see it hesitated, but it did at least pick it up, which means that when you're shooting it, it should do an okay job of cycling correctly. If your gun has more hesitation than that, or doesn't pass those tests, you know what your homework is at this point, right? Try and get a stronger spring, try and get a stronger spring, try and eliminate friction in the bolt group or friction in the carrier. And that's really what it comes down to trying to get these things to work correctly. Other feeding hangups and mishaps that you can run into on these guns generally revolve around shell length. The documentation I've seen for this gun says that it was either made for 2.5 or 2 9/16 inch 12 gauge. However, two guns that I've been able to inspect in person were both 2 3/4 inch chambers, and they would only work with 2 3/4 inch shells. I don't know if this means that someone converted them sometime in the past 120 years or whatever, or it could be possible that 2 3/4 inch factory guns were made. It's really, really hard to say what with the long history these guns have had, the poor documentation that's going on around them. However, what you could do is, of course, start with measuring the chamber, right? If you're messing around with old school shotguns, it's a decent idea to get a chamber measure checker. I've just got some 3D printed ones that I have floating around. This is the same length as a fired 2 3/4 inch shell, and if we plunk it there into the chamber, it fully chambers, right? So this will go all the way into the chamber, indicating that this thing has a 2 3/4 inch chamber. I've got one that's longer than this, right? And it will not quite chamber. So this thing's, full length of this thing's chamber right before the forcing cone, 2 3/4 inch, right? So there's an unfired 2 3/4 inch shell. When it's folded out, it's that long. There's no binding. This one chambers fully. So this gun has a 2 3/4 inch chamber. I don't know what chamber length your gun has, and you should check, because these guns are pretty shell length sensitive. Because of how their feeding cycle works, right? That finger has to be hit by a shell that's pushed backwards out of the magazine tube, and then the position of the next shell is going to be set by this spring. You can run into a situation where too long of shells for your gun won't want to cycle or feed reliably, and then may also not be safe, but we're not going to get into that discussion here now. Shells that are too short will not cycle because, as we can demonstrate, here's a couple of 2.5 inch 12 gauge shells. Black ones are 2.5 inch, just a little bit shorter than standard. But if we put them in there and then pull the bolt back like it's trying to feed, well, first off, we got 2 there, and that's obviously not right. sometimes that jam will happen, but then the other jam that will happen sometimes, see if we can get it rigged up here, is that if it doesn't pop too up, there we go, we've got it primed there. With the finger fully depressed there, this shell is so short that it is not holding the next shell back onto that steel finger there. So whenever the carrier tries to come up, it gets locked by the next shell in the magazine, because this gun is set up for 2 3/4 inch. The actual length of the finger and how it interacts with the shell is length specific. So these things cannot run 2 1/2 inch shells if they can run 2 3/4 inch shells, which is just a fantastic situation. So if your gun locks up with a jam that looks just like this, right, 2 shells are trying to stick their way out, and you're trying to use 2 1/2 inch shells, your gun might be set up for shells longer than 2 1/2 inch. In the case of my gun, it's set up for 2 3/4 inch. Now, this brings us to the discussion of load weight. Back when these guns were new, 12 gauge black powder shells were probably more common than smokeless powder shells. Because of this, the heaviest loads that existed around this time, the time this gun were made, were quite a bit lighter than the heavy loads that exist today. In 2 3/4 inch 12 gauge, you can get like 4.5 dram hunting loads, or turkey loads like pushing almost 5 drams from 2 3/4 inch 12 gauge. That's ridiculous, and it will beat the daylights out of this gun because they didn't have words to describe what that was. I guess maybe they did. It was like 10 gauge and 8 gauge shotguns were made to fire loads like that. This was most certainly not. So whenever you're trying to select ammo for these guns, I recommend that you try to stick to 2 3/4 or 3 dram loads. Like at the heaviest, do a 3 1/4 dram load. But I'll tell you, with my gun, 3 1/4 dram loads are not comfortable in it, and you can feel the gun beating itself up more. Meanwhile, with a 2 3/4 dram load, the bolt is just barely bottoming out on that like rearward stop, like it's just barely hitting against the end stop. With a 3 1/4 dram load, it's pounding into that end stop, and you don't want that, right? With as old as these guns are, and as kind of crumbly as they were made, the steel quality in them is not fantastic. You don't want to be beating them up. So use as light a load as you can. Make sure you're using the right length shell for however it is that your gun is set up. The 2 that I've had a chance to inspect were both 2 3/4 inch, so maybe they all are. I really can't tell you. I don't know. Of course, then again, I guess I've seen people whose guns run correctly with 2 1/2 inch or 2 9/16. So these guns are just sort of a question mark maybe as far as shell length goes. Know enough about gunsmithing before you get into trying to make one of these run that you know how to check what shell length your gun's set up for, and use those shells, and try to keep it on the lower end of the load spectrum. For example, this is a 3 dram load, right? This came out of my box of 1 1/8 at 1200 foot per second. This is the heaviest stuff that I would recommend you put through it. These short ones are 1 ounce at like 1180 foot per second. That's a 2 3/4 dram. It's a relatively light load. For example, this stuff, I have put a ton of this stuff through this gun, like 300 or 400 rounds at this point. Runs them good, and it doesn't beat itself up too much. Of course, if your shell length is different, this may vary for you, but in a 2 1/2 inch shell, right, these are about an equivalent load to this 2 3/4 inch shell. Try and keep it around 2 3/4 dram. 2 3/4 dram does not mean 2 3/4 inch. If you don't know what drams are, in a nutshell, it sort of refers to how much recoil the gun has, but that's like a gross oversimplification. Go and learn about that on your own separately as far as what a dram is, but try and keep these guns on a diet of lighter loads if you possibly can. That said, some people who I've seen running these guns and talked to that actually shoot theirs will have their guns not recock the striker or not cycle when using 2 3/4 dram loads. The only thing that I can assume there is that their guns were never fired very much and their drive spring is not worn out at all. We know for a fact this gun's had quite a bit of wear in it, and the broken pieces in it would certainly lead me to believe the gun has had quite a few rounds put through it. And as a result, maybe its drive spring is a little bit more wore out. So then maybe there's now a caveat to the caveat where if your drive spring doesn't want to run, those lighter loads, you can move up to a slightly heavier load, because the nature of inertia operated shotguns is that the actual reciprocation of the bolt, which is usually what beats up the internal pieces of the gun, right? Certainly in the case of the Sjogren, it's the reciprocation of the bolt that beats up pieces of the gun, not the firing of it. The firing, it doesn't really hurt anything at all. Like maybe the striker, because the striker is a little fragile, but who cares about that? It's all of the little bits in the gun that we worry about because there are a lot of weird shapes. those all get beat up as a result of the gun cycling. Because of how the drive spring in an inertia-operated shotgun works, you can have, depending on the strength of your drive spring, you can have the same exact cycling energy with a 5-dram load as you do with a 2-dram load. It all just comes down to how much that spring compresses and then uncompresses and the time in which it compresses. I'm probably exaggerating. I don't think that you could get 2 and 5 dram to have the same exact cycling energy, but inertia-operated shotguns, by way of how they work, by way of how the action spring gets compressed, sort of attenuate, right? There's a load that that action spring is happy with, and there's an upper bound and a lower bound that it will still work with, but it's meant to be around that happy load. And your task as a Sjogren owner then would be finding what that happy load is and then feeding it until something in the gun breaks, and then it becomes an endless cycle of trying to keep the silly thing running. At least that's how it's been for me. But with all that said, I think we've talked probably enough about troubleshooting with these things. We've at least hit the like the 101 level lessons in owning a Sjogren that I've come across in my admittedly pretty brief time owning the gun, but I have shot it a ton in that time because I'm OCD enough about the cool shotguns that I have where I want them to work, and because somebody had already broken pieces in this gun and tinkered with this gun quite a bit, and potentially somebody else converted this gun to 2 3/4, and somebody else broke the striker and repaired it very poorly, I felt okay taking the liberties of making new parts for this gun or repairing parts in this gun or polishing parts up in this gun to make it so the gun works as reliably as possible, because I want this to be a very reliable example of the thing, because I don't know that these things could have possibly been reliable in the first place, just knowing what I know about them. They're like mousetrap, cockamamie, crazy guns. Certainly would have been hilarious to walk into a gun store and see an Auto 5 and this side by side, and I really wonder what would have had to have gone through your head to go, that's the one I want. Of course, they both would have been very foreign to you at the time, but it would have been amazing to be in that situation and choose the Sjogren and then go through the character arc of the gun doesn't work at all and all your friends have Brownings that just work perfectly, because long recoil shotguns are perfect and whatever this is just different. But it's just very neat to me, I guess, that sort of intersection of like real life history. You as a consumer could have bought this when it was new, and that's kind of neat. But all that said, I think we've covered all of the stuff that we need to know as far as introductory and troubleshooting and how the thing works in the first place material. Let's get on to the part of the video that most of you are here for and see the thing shoot.
Alright, we're outside here with our Sjogren and ready to do a little bit of shooting with it. We'll be shooting clay targets today, thrown from this machine right here next to us. A standard disclaimer on the channel is yes, these will present pretty easy targets because we are so close to where they're being thrown from. However, what we're trying to do is prioritize you guys' viewership experience, because it's difficult to see hard to shoot targets through a camera just by nature of them moving and it being difficult to pick them up and then track them through a camera. So relatively close targets to give you guys a little bit more pleasurable viewing experience. While we're out here, we'll go over the process of loading and unloading, the controls on the gun, do a little bit of shooting with it to give you guys my overall impression of how it handles, and then we'll do a little bit of slow-mo and a little bit of explainer, and hopefully see in live action a few more details about how this gun actually works. And so, without further introduction, let's go ahead and get the thing loaded. Now, the first thing to do with these guns whenever you get one is check the status of the striker. If the striker is in the lowered position, right, the striker's in the forward position, you cannot retract the bolt. The striker being forward locks the bolt in place. So your first step would be to raise the striker flag, like so, then move it back to its original position, at which point the bolt can be manually retracted. Pulling the bolt all the way to its rearward stop, we'll hold it open if there's not another round in the gun. We'll have the bolt in this position to begin loading. We'll start off here with just 3 rounds. The first round can be placed directly into the chamber, but I find it a little bit easier just to sort of place it down into the action like that. At this point, there's this finger, this release there on the bottom of the gun, part of the carrier. Whenever you push this release up, the bolt will go forward. While it's entirely possible to send the bolt forward like that just by using your finger to push the button, if you're going to be putting multiple shells into the gun, sort of the cool way to do that is take your next shell, push the button with that, which will send the bolt home, and then you can insert more shells. When inserting a new shell, you do still have to depress this button, right? The carrier cannot just be pushed up on its own, but just because of the angle that you have to push a shell in at, you'll end up getting the button pushed out of the way no matter what, and then can put rounds into the magazine tube like so. The capacity on the Sjogren is 1 round in the chamber plus 4 rounds possible in the tube. As we prepare to fire, again, this flag on top of the striker here can be used to lock the firing pin back. In this condition, the trigger will not fire the gun. We can lower the striker, and then we have a separate tang safety as well. When the tang safety is in the rearward position, the trigger is blocked from being pulled. When it's in the forward position, the gun is ready to fire. Before we shoot something, I do want to get a couple of thoughts out of the way. The Sjogren does balance rather well. It doesn't have a lot of weight out front owing to a relatively thin barrel profile, a slim handguard, and a thin wall magazine tube. Additionally, you have a lot of mass concentrated in the receiver, 1 pound in the bolt shutter parts itself, plus a heavy milled steel receiver as well. As a result, the gun does swing rather naturally. However, I find that it points rather poorly, and a lot of this owes to the fact that the sight picture that you can get on this gun is kind of wonky. You aim along the top of this groove there on the receiver and have the bead sort of sit in that valley. This wouldn't be the worst sighting system ever, except that your eye is all the way back here, way behind where this valley is. So getting your eye to directly line up with the valley is sort of an interesting, where do I position my head? And owing to the way that my face is shaped, this stock does not want to position my cheek in the right position so that my eye just gets right behind the sight as I snap the gun up into my shoulder. We'll do a couple of shooting drills here in a little bit where I can explain more about why having a gun that doesn't point supernaturally can be a problem, but that's probably my biggest gripe in the handling of the Sjogren. However, we've gone far too long of talking without actually shooting something, so we'll go ahead, kick the safety off, get ourselves lined up, and shoot the 3 shells we have in the gun. Interesting, and there on our last round, we had one failure that you can sometimes run into with these guns. As we explained in the mechanics section of the video, of course, recocking the striker is a part of the inertia operation of the action. And sometimes that action spring provides enough resistance that it can't get compressed enough to allow the striker to get recocked. In this instance, the gun does not cycle. However, recocking the striker, disabling it, lets us pull that round manually out of the gun. That is a relatively uncommon jam on these things, and of course shooting rounds that generate a little bit more recoil tends to help with that. However, these are 120-plus-year-old guns, and this particular one, as we've explained, was converted to 2 3/4 inch. As a result, I shoot the lightest loads that I can in these that will still get it to cycle, and that's this 2 3/4 gram cheap Winchester stuff. I know some people with guns that are a little bit less clapped out and end up having to shoot loads that are quite a bit heavier than these. However, this gun is a pretty good match for these loads, and it doesn't beat me or the gun's parts up very much, so I'm just going to keep using them. However, with that discussed, let's go ahead, get the thing loaded up to full capacity, and just see if we can't hit 5 in a row. There we go, gun's loaded up, and we'll start with the gun up in our shoulder. Ah, I shot ahead of that one. Try another. There we go. And the gun did properly lock back on its own this time, which is how it's supposed to work. This time, let's try something similar where we put 5 rounds into the gun, but this time we're going to shoot with the gun down at our hip. So whenever we pull the target, we'll have the gun out of our shoulder, so we'll have to snap the gun up into our shoulder, get a good lead on the target, and then shoot at it. This, I think, is the biggest weakness of the Sjogren, is the way that the receiver and the sight lineup are not terribly intuitive for doing this sort of shooting. Perhaps if the way the gun's stock was shaped fit you just a little bit better, this wouldn't be as big of a problem, but for me, the giant distance between where your eye is and where the receiver plane is and where the bead is just make this a real difficult thing. But we'll see how good we can do despite all of those factors here. That wasn't bad, but to be entirely honest with you guys, I never really saw the top of the receiver relative to the bead. That was more of a, I think I've got a good lead at it and shoot. Try another one here. That was slow, but that was adequate, right? I did get a good picture, got in front of it, and was able to hit it. Try another. I couldn't figure out where the sights were, and the darn thing didn't cycle. Go ahead and kick that one out here. Go ahead, get it shut back up. Try another one here. To be honest with you guys, again, I saw the front bead and then I tried to get my lead and then lost my sight picture entirely, but did still manage to hit it. Try one more. Well, that's not terrible. I certainly did better there than I expected I would do. I expected that would be a little bit embarrassing by the end of it. All this to really say that with something like the Auto 5 and its humpback receiver, or even similar guns that start the sighting plane back closer to your eye, you can focus your eye on that a lot better as you're getting the gun up into your shoulder. It could be possible that I'm sort of thinking about the kinematics of this all wrong, but at least the way that I've learned to shoot shotguns, as I'm pulling it up into my shoulder, I focus on the rearmost part of the sighting plane, find it first, put the bead on top of it, and then go from there. With this gun, that's very difficult because, A, that sighting plane just sort of blends into the rest of the geometry back here, and your eye's not sure if it's supposed to be looking here, or here where it's actually supposed to be. Additionally, that plane is so far in front of your eye that any slight misalignment in your eye is going to make this plane move much further, right? And that's really just a geometry problem, right? Where if this plane was back here, a slight misalignment in your eye would only make a slight misalignment here, but with it this far forward, a slight misalignment in your eye or your head makes this move all over the place, especially relative to the front sight, which can make it a little tricky to shoot quickly. So in addition to the slow-mo that you guys have seen already of the gun and the slow-mo that'll be interspersed throughout the rest of the video, one thing that I wanted to get a good slow-mo shot of is how far back the bolt comes relative to your eye. So what I'm going to do is sort of bojangle the gun in front of a camera and then shoot it and get slow-mo footage of it to show you guys that as you're shooting this thing, the bolt doesn't actually feel like it's coming very close to your eye. And in fact, with where your eye sits, there's like a good 5 or 6 inches of separation. As unnerving as it seems it would be to shoot a gun that has a great big heavy bolt block that comes and jumps back at you like that, it's really not something that could contribute to giving you a flinch or a bad problem. At least for me, right? The first time I shot the thing, I was terrified of that bolt coming back at me. And then after 5 rounds, I realized I forgot to even notice that the bolt's coming back, because as far as the things that you're concentrating on, the bolt doesn't come close enough to your eye to make you go, ugh, that wasn't safe. But hopefully this video here will give you guys a general sense of what that's like. Well, everybody, that's been our look at the Sjogren. Ordinarily, we go inside for a closing thought section, but I figure we'll just go ahead and do that outside here now because the weather is so nice. If I was to find the things that I criticize most about this gun, it's the fact that they generally weren't made very well, right? They're fragile and they do break parts. In addition, even whenever their parts are made or remade or not fragile, they're not terribly reliable guns. And of course, it's easy to understand that this thing came from a time where automatic shotguns were in their infancy. When the prototypes of this gun were being made, Browning was still in the prototype stage of the Auto 5. This is a really, really old design, and it's just a little unfortunate for it that the way its mechanism was designed wasn't as good or as well thought out, or perhaps as refined as Browning's Auto 5. Of course, the Auto 5 saw a lot of iteration and a lot of development before the public was ever exposed to it. As far as I can guess, there wasn't nearly as much development that went on into this gun because there's a lot of things in the gun that, with a little bit more work, could have worked a lot better. My biggest gripes with the mechanism, of course, are the way that feeding is accomplished. Even if we ignore the way the striker works, which is a little wonky and usually is reliable, assuming you're using shells that have enough recoil, the way that the gun actually tenders shells, right, whenever a shell comes back and hits the lifter, for as weak as the action spring is on this gun, for it to be able to pick the carrier up with a shell on it and have the bolt come forward, and of course that runs on a cam instead of like a toggle dog spring-loaded system like we're used to seeing from other shotguns, a lot of work has to be accomplished by that relatively weak recoil spring. And most of these guns have that spring collapse or fail or wear out because it is getting compressed quite a bit, and it's not a very big spring, especially compared to the great big massive bolt that it's trying to stop. And of course, because of this, one of the most common feed problems that you'll see on these guns are those failures for the bolt to go forward, or the carrier having to be bumped or jiggled in order for the bolt to be able to come home. As far as handling is concerned on the gun, I don't hate much about it. The fact that you have to mess with the striker flag in order to recock it is a little inconvenient whenever you have the gun jam up that way. However, these things aren't really known to light strike, except for that issue that we talked about previously, where if the magazine spring is too strong and the action spring is too weak, it can hold the gun slightly out of battery, and then it will be light strike city. The ergonomics of the thing besides that, though, really aren't bad, except for the sighting plane's not fantastic, and the way this stock fits me isn't very good. Talking with other Sjogren owners and then handing this gun to other people, they all seem to echo my sentiment that the way the sighting system is set up isn't very good, and then the height of the stock is just wrong for most people's faces. I don't know if Mr. Sjogren had a particularly funny shaped cheekbone, but getting your head down on the stock makes it so the sights aren't really presented right, and then getting your head up high enough is a real big guessing game because of how far forward that rib on the receiver actually is. So in closing, while I think this is a really, really cool and unique firearm, I don't understand why people want them so much. I think it may just be a thing where it's cool and it was in the video game that everybody liked, and so they want to like the gun. But then once you get one in your hands, they're not very reliable, they're temperamental, they break parts, they're picky on loads. One gun to the next can be differently picky about different loads, and like the most bizarre, like it would lead you to believe these guns were all handmade. But the parts are relatively interchangeable, it's just that the way things shake out. One gun will cycle perfectly with 2 3/4 dram ammo, but not at all with things lighter or heavier, and then you'll find another gun that wants 3.5 dram plus and not anything lighter. And this will be the takeaway for you guys that are interested in sticking around for more videos on inertia-operated shotguns. This specific issue ends up being the hill that inertia-operated shotguns have to climb. And even the most modern ones offered today don't climb this hill particularly well, because they have that spring balancing act going on in them. Of course, you can remove some of the spring balancing acts by designing the rest of the gun better, and Benelli certainly pulled that off. You still have a spring balancing act that has to take place, and that spring balancing can really only be right for one particular load of shot shell. You can go up a little bit or down a little bit from there, but it's going to suffer in reliability going either direction from what it's specifically designed and specifically set up for. And that's really the Herculean task of inertia-operated shotgun actions in general, is getting them to cycle reliably with as wide a variety of loads as possible. Of course, different weight drive springs can be installed in bolt carriers to try and make them work one way or another. It's particularly true of the Benellis. But at the end of the day, it's not going to be a system that's as easy as, say, on the Auto 5s, right? Flipping a friction ring around to adjust for loads, in my mind, is the ultimate system meant to compensate for the difference in variety in shotgun loads. And everything else that exists out there is just something that, in my opinion, only offers downsides without any real upside. But we'll take a look at more of these systems later. For now, we'll go ahead, shoot these last rounds out of the Sjogren, and then send you guys on your way. There you have it. Of course, I have shot this gun a lot, so that does make it a little easier to shoot. I was not very good at shooting it before, but it is possible to learn shooting it well. And maybe that is a decent closing thought, is that sure, it's temperamental, sure they have parts breakage issues, right? They've got all sorts of problems. We've already talked about those. But at the end of the day, it does at least work. After sufficient gunsmithing and work and swearing and unhappiness, they do at least work. And at that point, the only thing that I can really criticize about it is that wonky feeding system and how slow it makes the gun want to cycle. But all that said, I hope you guys have enjoyed this incredibly deep look at the Sjogren. We'll probably have the Sjogren back on the channel at some point, but I'm certainly interested in hearing from you guys in the comments if you've got any more questions about the gun, or you've got one that's broke or doing a particular thing. I'd like to say at this point I'm fairly well versed in understanding the mechanical issues these things can run into after having dealt with probably all of the common failures on this particular gun. If you guys enjoyed this video, or like videos like this, or like videos that aren't like this, we do a lot of those on this channel as well, go ahead and check out the Patreon if you're so interested. You can give me money dollars. More money dollars means more weird shotguns shot at clay targets, which, how is it possible not to like that? Anyway, I hope you guys have a nice time. I hope you liked looking at this weird gun, and I will see you next time.